For the past couple of weeks, we've been going over some scientific skills which allow you as a young biologist to see how data is collected and then ultimately how that data can help to explain various phenomena or at least compare and contrast to point toward a particular answer or the result in our case of Chester's murder. We've also been introduced to some basic chemistry, from ionic bonds to covalent bonds, recognizing that in chemistry we know that the living organisms such as that are made up of carbon also have hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. So what's the big question here is, how did these elements ultimately form different molecules? And these molecules in particular that we're looking at, these molecules such as amino acids, these molecules such as various carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and lipids, how these molecules came into being to eventually lead towards the formation of cells. Big questions. The idea is that there are various theories that go about. Some are supported by data, some are supported by more hypotheses in which data still needs to be collected. We're going to look at a couple of them. So when we look at the history of life on Earth, what we have to realize is that in this history of life, there is a timeline. Many of you are familiar with the idea of the time being measured in millions of years. A lot of time. Just think of your most boring class and multiply that by a lot of zeros, and you would come into what we consider to be a million years. The idea is that in a million years, things change. More importantly, we always think about living organisms, but we have to think about more particular the environment and how that environment changes. Many of you have seen documentaries in terms of the earliest history and how it was very, very, very fragile, very volcanic, very unstable. Even today, we still have earthquakes along various plate tectonics. The Earth is still relatively young when we look at the entire universe, which is estimated to be approximately 15 billion years, and we're looking at the Earth about 4.5 to 3.5 billion years old. Huge timescales. In those timescales, we have to look at the biological evolution, these huge leaps in which all of a sudden, after periods of long stasis and not much happening on a biological scale, we get huge leaps that these macromolecules form, cells form, primitive organisms, prokaryotic cells, eukaryotic cells, sponges, all of these things on a very, 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 very long time that they had to occur in terms of the Earth's history. We also recognize that in this history, there are mass extinctions. There are ancient habitats which simply cannot exist today due to the way that the Earth's gas, the Earth's atmosphere, the ozone layer, all of these have contributed to various changes in the Earth's history to where we find ourselves today with approximately 21% oxygen and 78% nitrogen and some other gases such as helium, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen. But what we're going to look at just briefly are some of the key mass extinctions that occurred in the early Earth's history. One thing that we're looking at is various hypotheses. One hypothesis is that these comets that float around through the universe ultimately came and collided with the Earth. Is it possible that these various comets came and brought with them molecules? Could they have brought with them nucleic acids? Could they have brought with them various proteins? There are some scientists from various universities, whether it's Brown University, I've read some, from the university in terms of various areas in Japan, as well as other parts of the United States and in England and Germany. There are thoughts that these comets may well have brought with them the possible beginnings, or shall we say the makings, for life on Earth. Still a hypothesis, which means, according to our understanding, the hypothesis itself can still be tested, right? It has to still be tested. The only way that it can be tested nowadays is in a lab, trying to simulate the environment of the early Earth, whether it was the ultraviolet radiation, the ozone layer, the gases, the temperature, even the way the aquatic makeup of the water, from the salinity to the pH. All of that has to be replicated according to the hypotheses of how these molecules originated. Many of you have seen this life on Earth. Often you see it in a more linear form. So what we look at, we're very familiar with this area here. That's where humans are. Many of you have seen movies in terms of Jurassic Park, the Permian period, the Mississippian, but we're looking at these eras. The largest era that we know of is the Precambrian. Constitutes approximately 80% of what we know in light of life on Earth. All the rest of that time frame, all the rest of these areas only account for 20% of the 4.5 billion years that we're aware of. What is most fascinating is that as we look at evolution of life only refers to most of the part this area. Rarely do we look at the evolution of macromolecules and the evolution of cells themselves. This is what the next unit is going to bring. I'm hopefully going to introduce you to the possible ways in which these macromolecules coalesced to ultimately form these prokaryotic cells. Okay, this is the main idea before we get into the big chunks of evolution, or what current evolution is in terms of Darwinism. The mass extinctions, I kind of call them redos of the Earth. The first one that we know of occurred approximately 443 million years ago. These mass extinctions, you realize that there are huge climate fluctuations. In this case, there's a huge massive ice sheet. The massive ice sheet occurred on land. That meant that many of the aquatic animals were somewhat spared from this huge mass extinction. The thing is that the near shore areas probably were not. Only if they were pelagic organisms, those found deeper in the different aquatic environments, whether they were marine or freshwater, perhaps escaped this first mass extinction. Then we have a second mass extinction. This occurred in the late Devonian era, approximately 359 million years ago. This is where almost 75% of all life that at that point extinguished itself. Again, we're looking at climate change. We're looking at various gases that were emitted into the atmosphere. The interesting part is fossil records show that many plants survived this area, and it leaves yet another question that has to be solved by scientists. Why animals died? It may well have been the various gases. Was it possible that if some of the gases became toxic to these animals, they were not able to survive? Still, it leaves more questions than answers for more biologists and the more scientists to try to determine. The other one was the Permian mass extinction, 243 million years ago. This, to me, was an interesting fact as I read through the BBC in terms of various science studies, was that it's thought that after the extinction of the mass extinction of the Permian area, 4% of the species that are living today are descended from that era. Notice how the crusted Earth is. It must have been another yet huge climate change. The atmosphere, the ozone layer, still allowed various meteors to bombard the Earth. Still a very young, very precarious situation in terms of the planet. Thus, life itself was not stable. Another extinction came approximately 200 million years ago. This is what most of us are familiar with. The onset, or at least the Jurassic era, which is where the rule of the reign of the dinosaurs occurred. Lots of plant life died out. If that was the case, we think about how organisms eat plants. These organisms that eat plants are also consumed by other organisms. If much of the plant life died out, here's our hypothesis, then it's very possible that many of the animal life that followed the plant life also would have died out and become extinct. Thus we get to what we're quite familiar with in terms of the famed Jurassic, the death of the dinosaurs. What happened? We still have to put in our mind's eye, our imagination. The Earth is still continually being bombarded by meteorites from the outer space. We do not have that protective layer for large mass extinctions. Large mass meteors. That's why it's thought that one of the meteors that is most likely to hit off the Yucatan Peninsula, there's still some data for that in light of when they do geological surveys, geological studies of the terrain, and what they find in the soils still indicate not only did the meteor hit, but also how did that occlude the various sunlight for the different plant organisms to obtain their sunlight for photosynthesis. So as I said, all of these are hypotheses. They lead towards more and more questions. We're going to see later on how we can use fossil evidence, so we can now use some DNA evidence to help explain and piece together this history of life on Earth. This is the one that many of us are familiar with, more of a timeline. So here we are, literally in the blink of an eye with respect to Earth's history. It's thought that way over here, this is what we're concerned about. How do these macromolecules coalesce to ultimately begin to form more complex organisms, to ultimately begin to form cold-blooded animals, to warm-blooded animals, to plants that were once very susceptible to extinction because all they were able to have were spores to bear their offspring, to ultimately we get these seed plants such as the giant conifers that we see, or any seed plant such as an angiosperm that produces peaches, in which the seed and the offspring is protected. So these are big questions. Don't know if we have any answer, but it's fascinating to study. So I leave you with the spiral, giving an idea of where we are and where we're going to look, and hopefully as we continue this unit to hopefully bring more and more light in terms of the course of evolution and how early life on Earth led to where we are today.